Operation Reconquista is a movement started and championed by popular YouTuber and Christian commentator Redeemed Zoomer. The goal of the movement is to take back the mainline churches that have now gone apostate in hopes that by doing so, American culture can be retaken by righteous Christians. On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by Timon Cline to examine Operation Reconquista in an effort to, hopefully, provide helpful criticisms to strengthen the efforts of redeemed Zoomer and culture warring Christians everywhere. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, doing my best to represent him well wherever I go. As I mentioned in the opening, I am joined by Timon Cline. So, Timon, go ahead and introduce yourselves to the audience for those who are not yet familiar with you and your work.
Sure. Thanks, Connor. I guess I should feel honored that I'm a return guest also. So something went right the first time. That's good to hear. I'm the editor-in-chief of American Reformer. I do some other things, but that's sufficient, I guess, because some of the material we're going to tackle we published earlier this year. Of course, I ran it because I find it interesting. So I thought it was an interesting debate. We'll call it Zoomer's ideas. I think still are gaining some attention and traction. So it's worth talking about.
Awesome. I completely agree. So before we get started, though, for you listeners, feel free to go on over to forgeandanvil.substack.com. You can put in your email there. That is where all of the show episodes go straight to your email when you subscribe. And then, of course, we do have some written articles by yours truly and other additional content that I put up there periodically. You can also throw in a tip in the tip jar if you feel inclined to support the show. We'd appreciate it. Of course, like and share this video to boost us in the algorithms. It really does help. Follow us on Twitter at Forge and A for additional content and updates on the show. Share this video and repost the stream on X and join us for Monday nights when we go live and take your chats. Tonight, we're recording this, and it's a pre-recording, so if you see this premiering live, we're not actually live, so feel free to send in your chats anyways, and I'll look back at the replay and hopefully get a kick out of it, so appreciate that. Awesome. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and start talking, Timon, about Reconquista. So I'm going to kind of just provide a poor man's summary of the movement. But before I do that, I do want to make sure to be clear that Redeemed Zoomer is definitely an ally to us and what we care about. He is a popular commentator, and as a result, I think that he gets a lot more criticism than small fries like me, I should say. And so I want to make sure that you viewers know that this is not me punching at Zoomer. This is me honestly just wanting to talk about Operation Reconquista. I had actually asked Zoomer to come on the show. Again, his platform is much bigger. I didn't get an opportunity to connect with him in that way. He's still welcome anytime. So if he feels like we've misrepresented him in any way, I will gladly host him and he can talk to you all directly and clear the air. So my hope is to represent him well. But I do have some concerns about Operation Reconquista. We'll get into that later on in the episode. But ultimately, I think that this is another brother just doing what he believes is the best tactic to try to move the culture for righteousness. And so we should absolutely applaud him for that. Anything you want to add to that before I kind of get into the summary of what Operation Reconquista is, Timon?
Sure. Yeah, I think Zoomer. I have a soft spot for Zoomer. I kind of like what he's doing. I like his style. I know he's gotten, as you said, some flack, at least online, from some of my friends, which is totally fair game. If you're going to comment publicly, you're going to get that, and you have to, you can answer it the way you want to, but it's fair game. But there's been some dust ups. I haven't followed all those, and I think even doctrinal debates and so on and so forth. But in this, I don't get into those. But in this kind of narrow context, dealing with the strategy, he's calling Reconquista, which I've never been in the middle of, but he claims to have, lots of people kind of involved in this this network. I think it's interesting, and it's worth talking about. And there's many of the instincts, the aspirations, the vibes. Vibes are very important and underrated. Those at least in one degree or another resonate with me. So I think it's interesting to cover or worth covering. So
Awesome. Yeah, I completely agree. Either way, we've got it figured out.
all right,
So
good deal.
we'll go ahead and just jump in from here. So for
Okay,
those of you who
cool.
are now watching this playback, I may just let you know here at the gate that we had some tech issues, so we just did a quick disconnect, but we are good now. So I want to go ahead and talk about the summary of Operation Reconquista. So essentially, this is my paraphrase summary. Operation Reconquista is a movement that Zoomer started with the goal of taking back the mainline churches, because so many of these mainline churches have very beautiful historic buildings and a ton of resources. Many of them have prime locations in the middle of important cities, and a history ultimately that allows these churches to really draw upon their roots, and they have significant cultural ties that these churches can boast about. But these are also some of the first churches that succumbed to theological liberalism, and many of them started by embracing women pastors, and now many of them are just openly LGBTQIA2 plus affirming, and all the like. So these churches have fallen far from biblical faithfulness, but simultaneously, these churches, as a result, have very, very small congregations. Many of them are completely dying out. And so, what Zoomer tends to do, and we'll talk more about the exact tactics in a moment from Zoomer's own written piece here. But essentially, he is hoping to get theologically conservative individuals to migrate into these shrinking liberal congregations in hope that they can take on leadership positions and ultimately flip the church around to become more biblically faithful. One of the things that he talks about is that even though some of these giant ones like the PCUSA, for example, are very theologically liberal, there's still a remnant of faithful biblical churches, and those would be the churches that he would encourage individuals to go to strengthen the numbers among those biblically faithful churches. But that is ultimately the gist of it. We can get a little bit more into tactics beyond that, but that is sort of the poor man's explanation of what Operation Reconquista is in a nutshell. Timon, anything to add?
No, I think that's a good summation.
Awesome. So that being said, I want to talk a little bit about some of the critiques that Zoomer has already given to conservatives in general within the church. So one of the criticisms that he offers is the idea of retreatism. We've talked about this on the show before as well. Whenever an institution starts to drift leftward, it does seem to be a conservative instinct to pull away from the institution altogether and to just sort of wash our hands and go and start our own thing. That's why you see from Harvard, you got Princeton, and all these major schools that we now know, all these Ivy League institutions that are so prestigious, and yet all of them have gone leftward. So it's kind of the example that conservatives, every time, instead of conserving the institution that they're a part of, they branch off, or they retreat, they start their own institution that is significantly smaller than the institution that they left. I've talked about this with the SBC and the conversations I've had around the SBC. I'd encourage you all to look back at that one, like the episode I did with Jared Moore, for example. Individuals have been calling for conservatives to leave the SBC and to start their own SBC. And Jared made a great point. All right, so let's say we get 10% of these individuals to go. That's 10% of the SBC. That's 10% of the SBC's financial power, and let alone the fact that it takes time to build up institutional power as well. So that is a very valid criticism that Zoomer has. Anything to add to that, Timon?
No, I think it is a valid criticism. We can get into in a little bit whether it is better suited as a criticism to current battles rather than sort of rehashing the past of how we should have acted in the PCUSA. For I mean, Zoomer's right about there being at least in that particular denomination, which I've never been a part of, but I do know of people who have remained in the PCUSA and certain presbyteries to try to kind of duke it out, and they've done it a long time, with success in that small, area, I guess you could say. And it's, it's sort of valiant and everything, but whether it's actually effective at saving the denomination, we can get into the general instinct he's critiquing about conservatism, conservatives generally, is one that I've made as well. So the SBC, let's use the SBC as an example that's current. My kind of message to many people who've no longer part of the SBC for about a decade now, I guess, but I grew up in it, is, conservatives, they are like the loving mother, right? That when you're asked, okay, well, who's it really belong to? We'll split the baby. The loving mother who built it, who actually loves it, cares for it, raised it up, of course says no, just take the baby. I don't want to split it. Conservatives, if they want to win, because we're not actually talking about babies here, is they need to be willing to destroy in combat what they've built so that their enemies can't wear it as a skin suit. So you need to be the Russians sort of combating the Germans, where you burn all of your towns in your retreat, if you're going to have to retreat, right? So that they can't use them and that you cut off their supply line, essentially. Conservatives just haven't acted that way for the kind of the instinct I illustrated. I think they need to start thinking that way. It's the only way to kind of be, because as you were laying out, that you can't simply replicate old powerful institutions. So you need to take it very seriously, and you can't sort of comfort yourselves with the idea that you'll be able to build your own Google, right? It's just not a thing that's readily available. So you should, my position is, in general, with institutions that we do still control currently, you should be willing to burn it to the ground before you let the left have it. So yeah. I think that critique is valid, and that's kind of my spin on it. But then we can get into the arguments for whether this is, we can reverse engineer anything, but I think generally it's an appropriate critique.
Yeah, exactly. A tool that I've been using for a while is the idea of reform what you can, build what you need, and destroy what you must. And so we can talk about whether or not some of these institutions fall under those different categories and what categories they fall onto. First, I'll talk just much more briefly about his other criticisms. The other one is complacency. And essentially, what I've heard Zoomer say previously is that conservatives are very complacent. We don't like actually putting in the effort to become high up in leadership of institutions in order to actually allow a conservative voice to be represented. I tend to agree with him with that. I've said it just last episode I recorded about how conservatives, our God is not government, and so you don't see conservatives super involved in government. We're focused on building our families, building our businesses, and focusing on kind of our individual spheres. But
and even
same,
if I could just add, even culturally, I think the thing we lionize is like the reluctant leader, right? That's pulled. Right. Watch basically just pick all your Mel Gibson movies. It's all the Patriot, Braveheart, whatever. It's the guy that's forced to into action because he loses everything, and right. So not that that's not admirable and really cool to watch, and it's something about it resonates. But in terms of institution maintenance, we don't typically, conservatives, reward or cherish ambition.
Yeah.
So being ambitious is actually, in many circles, especially ecclesial ones, suspect to us, right? We kind of have, like, we all want to be Ambrose and even Calvin. They both had the narratives of they really didn't want to be ordained or to be pulled into the church, but the people came and grabbed them and like forced them, whether that's true or not. It's kind of the thing we even treat the ministry that way often. The person has to be, you'll hear this in many evangelical circles, they have to be called. So they can't just read Timothy, Paul's letters to Timothy and say it's a good thing to desire this. I want to lead. I want to rule, essentially, in the church. That's immediately suspect. Now you can have bad actors play along either way. They adopt themselves, bad actors, always to whatever the sort of currency is. So it's not really a good sort of protection to swing too hard one way or the other. You have to be discerning in either case. But I think what's being pointed out there is that the complacency goes with the sort of grill American critique. We do just want to do our own thing. That's
Yeah.
totally fine. I'm something of a grill American myself. But we certainly don't reward ambition inside of institutions, or we haven't for a long time. And so therefore the people that typically rise to the top are the go-getters, the strivers, whatever you want to call them, that really, and with the left, they have no qualms of similar fashion. So I think that's also valid insofar as it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of his last critique is libertarianism. And it's sort of the live and let live. As long as you leave me alone, you can do what you want sort of attitude that we find among conservatives
Mm-hmm.
too. And the reality is libertarianism is not conservatism. But yet conservatives tend to act very libertarian. And whether that be a theological conservative or a political conservative, whatever you want to say, that is still a truth where ultimately we shy away from using power. And because we're always pulling the libertarian argument of what if they start doing this to us? Oh, what if the shoe was on the other foot? And it already is.
Mm-hmm.
But we focus on being so idealistic that we end up just again being complacent and end up really
Mm-hmm.
just being steamrolled over.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. It sounds like you're going to add something, Timon.
No, I think we can leave it there. I'd just say the general, since he's pulled that in, libertarian ethos. It's interesting that he applies it in this context. I think it makes some sense. Is like, instead of worrying about if the shoe's on the foot all the other foot all the other times, maybe you just take the power so that you make sure the shoe's never on the other foot. I
Yeah,
don't know. That's one way to approach it. At least that doesn't mean it's not justification for tyranny.
of
It's not a
course.
justification for being reckless or having, absolutely no accountability or something like this. But it is the general, what we're talking about is the sort of general orientation, mental and maybe even spiritual of people. And it's that approach of, let's waste all of our energy making sure no one can ever hurt us, and so therefore we can't do anything either, so that we're consistent. Is proven to not really work. It's not working, and being consistent is pretty overrated also. So,
Yeah,
you know.
exactly. So let's go ahead and talk about Operation Reconquista. And actually, I'm going to read from Zoomer. He talks about the 5 steps that they had for Operation Reconquista. So, my understanding is that some of these are steps that already took place, while others are steps that are basically just ongoing part of the operation as a whole. So, very first one, scouting. So, this is from Zoomer. I'm actually quoting from an article that he wrote for American Reformer. So, you guys can all take a look at it. I'll try to remember to put it in the show notes, but the title, in case I forget, is The Secret to Retaking American Culture. So you guys can find it there at AmericanReformer.org. So, scouting. First, we did research and scout out mainline churches across the country to find out which ones are theologically conservative. We sent brave pioneers to investigate local mainline churches. Then, between the months of January and April, we created a custom online map of theologically moderate to conservative churches in each mainline denomination. By the end, we had hundreds of theologically sound churches that were PCUSA, Episcopal, United Methodist, and more on our map. So that was sort of the first step in the process to Reconquista. Timon, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean it just sounds like trying to identify their targets, the weaker targets in the herd, I guess you could say. Seems
Awesome.
seems sensible. Yeah.
Then I'll move on to step 2 of their plan, community forming. On the first day of June, which was the month when a lot of people would be shocked to see a pride flag on their church for the first time, we started the official Reconquista Discord server, an online community platform. We used our social media influence to call all faithful mainline Protestants everywhere to join it. Within the first couple weeks, we gathered hundreds of people on our server, and by using our map, hundreds more found mainline churches to attend and then proceeded to join our group as well. Our Discord community is split into subgroups for each denomination, so we are able to start a specific Reconquista group for Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, etc. I think that this is an awesome step. Again, I commend him for this. It's wise to not only be organized, but to form community, because if you are going to be trying to retake an institution that is very left leaning, there's going to be a lot of losses in that battle, and having a community of like minded individuals who are aiming for the same goal as you is going to be exactly what you need to push yourself through the days where you feel like giving up. Anything to add to that, Timon?
No. I mean, I think like in general, their steps or his outline of a strategy, are pretty unobjectionable. I mean, we need to cover the rest of them. I know, but I think any of the critique lies elsewhere. Generally, I haven't seen anyone say, "Oh, that's really bad that you would connect these disaffected mainline remainers, across the country
Right.
through, obviously it was a somewhat new technological means." So,
Yeah. So let's go ahead and just bust out these last few real quick then. So, number 3, connections and alliances. Some of the people who joined our Discord community were pastors, so they got us connected to the various conservative alliances that already exist in these mainline denominations. In September, the Reverend Jake Dell, an Episcopal priest who had written articles endorsing us, invited the leaders of our Episcopalian Reconquista community to a national gathering of conservative Episcopalian priests and bishops in Dallas, Texas. There, we handed out the articles he had written and got dozens of priests on board with our movement, including a few bishops. The Episcopal Reconquista founded their own independent organization called the Episcopal Fellowship for Renewal and got connected to community partners, the Conservative Alliance of Episcopal Priests. We Presbyterians have done something similar. We started Presbyterians for the Kingdom and are getting connected to Theology Matters, an existing organization dedicated to getting Orthodox PCUSA pastors through seminaries and into PCUSA church pulpits. The rest of the denominations in the Reconquista have all made their own denomination-specific organizations. These organizations continue to grow every day and are working with faithful pastors in their mainline denominations to evangelize and produce theological content. 4, outlasting. This is what will come next. Now that we are making alliances and thriving conservative sub-communities within these mainline denominations, all we need to do is wait for a little while the liberal churches, for the liberal churches to keep dying out. This will be easier than ever, given that there is such a severe pastor shortage. Most mainline churches are, in fact, so desperate for leadership that they will let any young person who joins have a major position. This means that in addition to preserving conservative congregations, we can also push moderate mainline congregations into a more conservative direction. This will take up to a generation, but the math checks out. There are so many more evangelicals who attend church regularly than mainliners, and that gap continues to widen. The more evangelicals we can get to start flooding the mainline churches, the sooner they will be retaken. Once the conservative minority becomes a majority, we can finally reverse all the liberal changes that have happened over the years and enforce adherence to the confessions and creeds. Step 5, reunification. Our final goal is to reunify all the mainline denominations with their conservative offshoot counterparts. That means reunifying the PCA and the PCUSA, reunifying the Episcopal Church, the ACNA, reunifying the United Methodist Church with the Global Methodist Church, and so forth. Mainline denominations have a surplus of resources, but a shortage of members and pastors. Evangelical offshoots have a surplus of members and pastors, but a shortage of resources. So reunification seems like the obvious solution. But in order for that to be realistic, we need to correct the errors of the main lines that cause these splits to happen in the first place. So that is a more thorough breakdown of the entirety of the Reconquista movement as a whole, every single step there. So, Timon, anything to add to that before we just get into general critiques?
um, well, what I was going to add is kind of a critique. So let's take it in order then. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah. Well, let's just go ahead and dive straight in, though. So, I'll go ahead and let you start. Then, feel free to just fire away.
Sure. Okay, I'll start with the last point then, because it's a practical question, I guess, which is, okay, we'll start here, and then it leads into, I think, a bigger question about the whole theory. So one is, the general supposition that this reunification at the end, like let's say that they take take back at least a sufficient number of churches that they can then control the denomination and steer it into some kind of reunification effort with its conservative offshoots, right? So OPC and PCA, along with PCUSA. I don't. It would have to be demonstrated with me. I don't understand the idea that the conservative offshoots like a PCA are lacking in resources, but have a surplus of people. It doesn't appear to me that the PCA is looking for partners for money or for buildings or for seminaries or anything like that, just, you know, in a functional sense. The same would go for the SBC. I mean, I know I've heard Zoomers say before that in a certain way the SBC could be considered a mainline denomination. I think I actually think that's wrong in a sense. I've said it in a certain way that it's old enough. It's really getting at that it's old enough. But of course, the Southern Baptists are the in a way the product of a split with the Northern Baptists. You know, it's just happened to occur in the early 19th century. So there's not a. The point is, there's not a unified Baptist American denomination. And that goes back a long time. So if you have the American Baptist Association or whatever it's called, that's now basically dead from what I can tell. I mean, I think Andover was one of their last seminaries that closed recently, and I think Yale just kind of took everything it had. Point being, I mean, that's like what incentive is there for the SBC to ever say we would like to reunite with these dilapidated Northern Baptists rather than just envelop them? You know, it's the SBC itself is very old, has the biggest seminary in the world, has the most people of any most members of any Protestant denomination in the country. You know, so where's that incentive? I don't really know, but maybe, you know, it seems more likely that they would take in the refugees of these other churches and just you know, be happy to have them. So that's one critique, but it kind of goes into the thing that's underneath that, which is tracing even the mainline to who qualifies. Because, you know, what I appreciate about Zoomer is he's establishmentarian. I like that. Two, he wants historical continuity and wants to sort of stop the bleeding with infinite Protestant, like fissiparity, you know, just splitting all the time, split down to, you know, maybe like Roger Williams, where it's like you and your family worshiping at the end of his life. Yeah. So that I appreciate. That's a good thing to want, and to try to figure out how to do this in an American way that attaches you back to the tradition of Protestantism that you have, which obviously came through the what we now call the mainlines. But even tracing the mainlines is very difficult, because you take something like the UCC, which he identifies, I think, as a mainline denomination, and most people do. It's not like the UCC as an organization or institution. It's kind of hard with the Congregationalist model, but is traceable to 1630, right? Like this it's the sort of product of multiple splits and combinations throughout hundreds of years. I mean, the UCC itself, I think, is a mid-20th century product, and there were others before it, and there's ones that were part of the union it came out of that are still around. They're just smaller and they're like a little more conservative. So that's a question I even have in terms of continuity. If we have sociologically designated certain denominations mainline, and that makes sense for sociological analysis. But if you're wanting to, if part of your motive for this project is to reconnect Protestant historical churches with their later offshoots, they themselves are basically offshoots, and you have, so then you're kind of at a place where you're like, well, maybe what we're really doing is just recovering historical denomination or historical congregations, not the denominations themselves as a whole. But even there, the continuity, apart from just the buildings, and even not there, you know, because the example I'm going to use is First Church Boston. I don't think there's a single person there probably who's related to John Wilson, its founding pastor, or anyone else from 1630. Probably not. Maybe there are. Probably not. And even their building was, you know, the original building was, I believe they went through a couple renditions and then it burned down. And so the building they have now is from like 1865 or something, right? So even it's much older. It's awesome. It's a great building. I'd love to have it. But it's not this like thick continuity that we would all love to have that rivals the feel you get with certain medieval cathedrals, many of which, of course, themselves were built in the 19th century. But there are, of course, ones that are actually hundreds and hundreds of years old. And that's what we always kind of want, right? So maybe you could do it with Christ Church in Philadelphia, right? Which at the time of Washington's life was like the tallest building in the country. It'd be great to have that. But the continuity there, other than the building itself, seems to me to be ephemeral. I'm not really sure what's being pursued in that way, other than getting back historic buildings, which I do think are very important. I think architecture is very important, as is history in that sense. But you're going to be necessarily filling it with different matter, different substance, just as it is already filled with different substance. So that's something that doesn't make much sense to me. Just as it's very difficult to trace the denominational kind of lives snaking through the centuries at this point, especially through even at the Great Awakening. So it's prior to the founding of the country. You're having all kinds of splits and things like that. Yeah. So that's a difficulty. That's like a historical difficulty to me, and a conceptual difficulty.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where I'm at as well. It really does seem like Zoomer's emphasis is really just ultimately on the historical building, because like,
which I think is great. Like, I want the buildings.
Sure, exactly, exactly. But it's almost like, shouldn't we just wait for them to put it for sale?
Yeah,
I mean,
the one problem there is, and this is totally anecdotal, but that he would probably affirm. One problem of waiting around for the buildings is the people that run these denominations. Again, anecdotal experience, because I've never been part of a mainline denomination, but I know of a church that was in upstate New York, that was part of that left the Episcopal church. Right, they had a very historic building, and they had a a strange majority of conservatives they wanted to leave for the ACNA, right, and they wanted to take their building with them, and they offered to the diocese to pay market value for it. And the diocese rejected that and sold it under market value to Buddhists to spite them, right? So that's part of the difficulty here is you're like, okay, let's just wait around and get it let's let the congregations die out and just take the buildings. There's still an apparatus that controls them, and it's pretty vindictive, and that may be a difficulty. Other churches, I remember in the area in Philadelphia I was in, they were sold, to be repurposed. I don't know if anyone else was coming around wanting them, but they all become something else, it seems, before anyone else can really get to them. Certainly a fledgling, congregation of like Reformed people aren't going to be able to raise the funds for it. Right. So then you just have a fundraising problem. You'd have to necessarily, the best option might be attach yourself to an existing solid denomination that has resources and try to get them to earmark them for nice buildings in places if they're going to do a church plant. The SBC certainly has the money to do that, so, but this idea of you're going to get in, certainly it might be a better prospect to get in and see if you can trick everybody basically into giving you control. But even then, I just would doubt the ability to actually wrest away, these assets. Most of them, as part of Zoomer's whole point, is they're prime real estate. So I don't even know, if we're talking 20 years down the line, maybe that's possible. Maybe no one is really wants them at that point, and they probably cost more to keep up than they do to buy. So anyway, another like wrinkle kind of in the theory that's very nice. And we'd love to have, as he points out, all their church buildings, their libraries, these things. If you're doing historical work on colonial New England, you still have to go to Congregationalist churches that now have rainbow flags on them and are, Unitarian, which means it's like a club that has BLM rallies or something. It's not really a church, but they still have these. If you read like Harry Stout's book, The New England Soul, much of his research process is just going around to these Congregationalist churches and asking if he can dig in their basement. So that's true. Like a lot of our history is still with them, and they have it, and some of them do take that serious in a very secular way, but it's kind of strange. So those are resources, historical ones that matter for us that we would love to have, but we can get into whether the juice is kind of worth the squeeze in the end. But
right. Yeah. So let's talk about that squeeze, because that's something that I tend to have my biggest critiques come from is Zoomer talks a lot in some of his commentary about individuals retreating from the cities and individuals retreating from the main lines.
Yeah.
And to his credit, he has told me before, privately, that he would reserve this type of task to a Navy SEAL Christian, is how he described it. But to expect an individual to go to a liberal city in a liberal state and spend their efforts trying to turn this church, maybe if we're being real, let's say it's a moderate church, but in the middle of this liberal city in a liberal state, the reality is that is just not a ample opportunity for that individual to do anything outside of just trying to focus on changing this church, doing things like family building or business building. All these other things that are other aspects of life become so much harder in a very secular liberal state, in a very secular liberal city.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go down to Seattle, Washington with my small family with young kids in order to try to flip a moderate church more conservative if I'm putting my kids in a situation where I'm going to have to affirm their gender, or else my children are taken from me, or
just not be spiritually fed for a long
exactly.
time, right? I mean,
Exactly.
so yeah, I mean, Zoomer's analogy there, I think, is I've seen him say the same thing. He's not saying this is for everybody. He's not saying if you have a good church, you should leave it, so on and so forth. He provides caveats. But this demonstrates the difficulty of the task that he wants many people to take up. Is we could say spec ops guys, other sort of clandestine intelligence operators. They don't have good marriage records. That's like a known fact, right? For certain reasons, it is the job, as unpopular thing to say, as much of mission work is the jobs really for single men, because men that are married have duties to their family, and sort of offering your family as a martyr to this is I actually think contrary to scripture. It means you're not positioned to do certain things if you're married. And so this is like one of those times, right? It's kind of like people who still, not out of necessity, but sort of out of principle, insist upon sending their kids to public school, like they're missionaries in China, and it's their kid's job as a 10-year-old to be a martyr for the faith. I think it's ridiculous. This is the kind of stuff Vodi Bakum got canceled for, 2 decades ago. But anyway, this kind of idea, so it is a job for Navy SEALs. It's a job for I would say, single people that don't have to care about a family. But of course, how long are you going to do this? Because I think it is certainly a revelation, a natural revelation from God, that most people should be in families and be sociable in that way. So there's a duty aspect there of intentionally prolonging it. You'd have to check your conscience on that, I guess. But certainly it's not a job for families, I would say, for the reasons you stated. And it's a husband's duty to get their family in a good church under good preaching and good leadership, so that their family is discipled, so that he himself is discipled and preached to well, so that he can be the miniature pastor at his own house also, right? So he needs to be fed. So I think it would be a dereliction of duty for a husband to lead his family into this situation on purpose. Perhaps it is a different question if you're already in one of these, and it's where you've been and you're kind of stuck, and so on and so forth. I don't know, but for the Reconquista, in the main, kind of what's called for people to come together, organize, and go in. This is sort of like an activist thing, like young Marxists should do. They're capable of doing this. So, not calling Zoomer a Marxist, I'm saying it's the same mentality.
Right.
You're infiltrating something, and
you're behind enemy lines.
Hostile.
Yeah.
So that's not a good place for someone to, and certainly shouldn't leave their family to do it. Anyway, so that's another obvious difficulty of amassing enough 20-year-olds to do this. 20-year-olds also happen to need discipleship as much as the rest of us, and good preaching, and maybe especially so. So I don't know what all the there seem to be a lot of pitfalls here in this strategy that I don't think Zoomer is saying I don't care about people's souls. In fact, he will say otherwise, especially about the people in these churches. But it's just saying there's an aspect of soul care here that is probably not sufficiently accounted for in the theory in terms of making it operational and actually effective. The kind of movement you would need at scale to do this would probably be asking people to sacrifice in this way, and I don't know if that's workable or appropriate.
Yeah. And I honestly view Operation Reconquista in a positive light. I just view it like there is a very, very, very small pool of individuals that actually fit the mold that Zoomer would need to actually pull
Yeah,
this off
right.
successfully, like you just said. And the main reason why I think it's worth examining is because I think one of the things that I would give Zoomer a personal critique on is that he has counter signaled, other options like the Boniface option, for
Sure.
example, and the Benedict option. And of course, I disagree with the Benedict option, but I have a lot that I agree with the Boniface option. And in fact, what the short conversation that I had just through messages with Zoomer was actually spurred on because I had sent him your article on the Alfred option.
Hmm.
And to me, I very much view it as these are strategies, many of which can be implemented simultaneously. I think that
Sure.
the Alfred option, and for those of you who don't know, I did a whole episode with Timon the first time he was on the show about the Alfred option, so you can watch that episode for reference to get up to speed. But essentially, the Alfred option is building fortresses to outlast negative world. And
Hmm.
we are intentionally insulating ourselves from negative world. So I very much view the Alfred option or the Boniface option, some of these other options that have some real merit to them, as being sort of the main strategy. And if you want
Yeah.
to view Operation Reconquista, like your point, like special ops going behind enemy lines to scout, recruit, foil enemy plans, whatever the case may be. That's really how I would view Operation Reconquista. Because the other thing too is I've kind of already alluded to this, but it's really just focused on church life. But there,
Hmm.
I mean, although the church is important, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand what I'm saying here, the church is not the only part of life. And Christ is king over all parts of life, not
Hmm.
just the church. He's king over your business. He's king over your family. He's king over the schools. He's king over media. And so many of these other things go into playing up culture. I don't think that the church
Yeah.
is just one leg of the stool that ultimately produces the culture that we live in. And so
Yeah.
to sort of throw so many individuals at this Operation Reconquista, I think it's just possibly dangerous for the well-being of the movement if they don't
Yeah.
have, say, the Alfred option also working simultaneously, so that if they need to take a break, they can actually go behind allied territory,
Yeah.
to actually recoup.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the ideal for any of us is to have as integrated a life as possible, which is where all the things that you're doing um, are complementary, and a lot of that, if you live in a place that has like a real community, you go to church with people that you see at the grocery store and that you work with and that teach your kids math, right? Like that's ideal. So all these sort of circles are overlapping, and that's a very integrated life. Um, you don't have things pulling at you in different ways, and this would be so one analogy that Zoomer will make, and this probably gets at like my primary critique about Reconquista generally, is that the idea is these are centers, these churches, mainline denominations, they have been historically centers of cultural formation and status and power in America, and in this way they're analogous to the Ivy League schools. And so, there's often talk about like taking back Harvard and Yale and Dartmouth and everything else. So I've written a critique even of that with the Ivy League schools, of like, this is just not, we should not be doing this in this way, because recognizing that the only thing the Ivy League schools do is convey status. It's not about education, it's conveying status. And so we have to set up alternative or parallel status distribution. And part of that is simply, it goes along with the Fortress article, but it's like opting out of that status hierarchy and then being insistently kind of preferential in a parallel one where we only favor the things and the people that we like, which is exactly what they do. That's the only way you can kind of beat this, right? But so that's my critique of even the Reconquista of the Ivy League schools, which again, nice. I'd love to have Harvard's campus back to us, but it's just, it looks great. But there's nothing there that resembles anything about what we are nostalgic for. There's nothing there. So we need to start treating it that way. In fact, it's like beneath us, and that's how you can kind of beat this. Because we've already seen you can get the president of Harvard fired, and it doesn't matter. They just have someone next to come in. She gets an even more cushy job. I mean, this thing is very, of course, incestuous, and it's good at self-replicating. So I think there's no real prospect there. Other than, the benefit of someone like Chris Rufo's work is to get people to stop trusting them and caring about Harvard. That's like the benefit. It's not really taking it back. Okay. The bigger problem though for Reconquista is the mainline denominations are actually no longer part of or analogous to what the Ivy League schools produce. They used to be. They used to be part of the WASP establishment that you had to be. Especially by the 20th century, you had to be an Episcopalian and a graduate of Harvard or Yale and a member of the Skull and Bones Club and a member at the right sort of gentlemen's clubs in New York City or alumni clubs and go to the right golf course. Like it was this entire, apparatus of status conveyance that has all been either infiltrated by other parties or totally destroyed. And most of all with the mainline churches, they simply do not convey any kind of status anymore for culturally or politically. And so since they no longer do that in a way that's meaning they're no longer part of that apparatus that Harvard still is, they're meaningless to most people. Since they no longer do that, I don't really understand what the motive is for needing to take them back in order to change the culture or to change or to reclaim power in a certain way, because you're really not taking anything from the enemy in this sense, other than again the buildings. And if you're able to get the beautiful buildings, maybe build some more of your own, have things like that, these things, it does matter culturally. It can give a sense of a new elite, all these other kind of things you're trying to rebuild, but they themselves simply taking over the PCUSA will not get you control of Princeton. It will not get you on the short list to be president because you're a member of it like it used to. This is no longer the time where B.B. Warfield has Woodrow Wilson over at his house for dinner parties. Like that world is just completely gone. So my only point is there's no status left in them other than kind of what we remember them to be. And this is, again, inherent and kind of implicit in much of what Zoomer does point out, which is like the people that occupy these things, they don't really care about them. And why don't they care about them? Because they don't do anything anymore. It's not important. It's only important to us. Maybe that's good. That means that we'll eventually get them back, these beautiful buildings, and be able to connect again with it, part of that history of our country. But I just don't see dumping resources in them to get them like you might be able to justify doing for our colonial colleges, because they do still convey status and power. And then even on that, when we're talking about our old colleges, I've already kind of critiqued that strategy and saying this is a fool's errand. The way to beat them is to completely circumvent them. And you have to have a sort of parallel universe and stop trying to send your kids to Harvard. So that's my real critique of Reconquista, from a sort of macro level.
Yeah. And this may be too difficult of a question to answer, but I mean, do you think that Operation Reconquista should sort of disband their efforts and focus elsewhere? Do you think that they should be doing something like maybe trying to shore up, conservative institutions that we already have a hand on the wheel of, such as the SBC? I mean, what would be your advice to the leadership, whether it be Zoomer or other guys that are kind of high up in this Operation Reconquista project?
Yeah. Look, I think there's sure there's places they could redirect their efforts to help denominations and churches that are under fire or are going through natural kind of um, cyclical struggles you have in all denominations, and ensure that those struggles, those battles go the right direction so that you don't replicate the problem again. So I think that would be a valid use of time. Another one, Rhett Burns wrote something. He's an SBC pastor, wrote this for us at American Reformer a while back, was talking about there's all these, it's not as glamorous, but there's all these old Baptist churches and Methodist churches and things in the South, especially in the Bible Belt,
Yeah.
that are very small, but that are faithful, good churches. And we would call them conservative. They've not compromised in this way, but they need help, right? And they're going to eventually die out if someone doesn't help them. So it's a sort of revitalization program for churches that are low-hanging fruit. Essentially, if they got an influx of 20-year-olds, it would totally revolutionize their trajectory. So I think that would be a valid use of time. And then it goes along with my initial answer of how you're helping pre-existing denominations that are conservative, or at least conservative but maybe teetering, but they're the right now is like a pivotal moment for them. Having young people getting, sort of like where we started, aspirational to take power and to contribute in those denominations and help steer them. That would be, a valid use of time, a redirection of this same energy. And then, if a lot of Zoomer's own predictions, which I would share about the direction and future of some of these mainline denominations happen, but you've strengthened your other denominations now, your conservative ones, maybe you can go get the buildings and you can, in a sense, reestablish those congregations, that have been, I think, stolen and, like I said in the beginning, worn as a skin suit by people that don't deserve any of the historical pedigree that still remains there, whether
Yeah.
it's the location or just the general, the history, the memory of these places. So I think it doesn't seem to me that one strategy over the other is any faster or slower. It seems like both are going to take a long time. But in the meantime, you would be able to contribute to something that has energy and
Yeah.
funding behind it, and you would be able to do things that are important for a real revitalization or reconquista of anything, which is to have families and to establish generational roots and all these things, so that you don't replicate the problem later. And if all the 20-year-olds you bring into a PCA church or a Baptist church are dissatisfied with like meeting in a church plant bowling alley, do something about it that way. Go try to get the historic buildings or build something yourself. But it seems to me that it's a time of consolidation of energy amongst conservatives in churches to try to save what we have, fight for it so that you don't do this all over again. And then maybe you're able to go reclaim some of that physical territory at some point in the future. I'd be all for that. I would be all for churches spending more money to take back beautiful buildings than it would take to build, something ugly but utilitarian.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. I think that would be a tremendous victory if we could see that. This again, also another heavy question for you, but in your experience, do you think I've known of many Presbyterian brothers that will have joined up with maybe a Reformed Baptist church that's like
Mm,
1689 Baptist church, or vice
hmm
versa. I've heard 1689 confessing Christian join a PCA church just because they felt as though those individuals knew what time it was.
hmm
Do you advise individuals, such as individuals part of Reconquista, for example, them doing things like joining up with the Southern Baptist Convention? Because I know for a fact that Zoomer is not Baptist. He's
Yeah.
made no um, No, that has not been a secret.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But again, to your point earlier, the SBC is the largest entity that we have that's conservative. And of course, it doesn't have to be the SBC. That's just the obvious example because of how it is
Sure.
the largest. Do you advise these individuals be willing to overlook some of these secondary theological issues in order to sort of throw their weight and put their shoulder to the wheel, trying to, like you said, join up with something that already has momentum?
Yeah, maybe to a, um, what the rule of politics, like everything up to a point, because you don't want to uh, look. I'm like very big on a sort of American pan-Protestant unity and ecumenism, across the country. I think that's part of our DNA, um, and that's in the political and social sense. But I don't want denominations to lose their theological distinctives either. And so, the extent to which you can get into one that is as agrees with your theology as much as possible, I think is healthy. Um, and if you go to one where you have disagreements, it's up to you to not make a stink about it. That's for sure. Not to cause a problem. Um, but I want denominations and traditions to maintain their distinctives because it's
Yeah.
part of their integrity, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing. So, and there's certain directions these things can go there easier than others. For instance, the OPC church I was at in Philadelphia before we moved down south and are at a PCA church now. We had several 1689 Baptists that were in the church with us and were members. They couldn't be elders, but they were members. That's very easy because no one's forcing you to baptize your baby. We just
Yeah.
baptize the kids whenever the parents want them to. We had Baptists do that. Their kids be 8, 10, whatever. That's difficult in a Baptist church to get Baptists to baptize your baby after birth if that's what you want. So sometimes it can work one way easier than it can the other. But what you're pointing out is in our current moment, you do have this extra wrinkle, this extra consideration, which is, does the church I'm at, do they get it? Do they understand the challenges of the day that are facing? Because this is a matter, it's a pastoral issue in a certain sense. And I think it's incumbent upon us to be very patient with people, and to not expect pastors to be um, plugged into absolutely everything. Their job is word and sacrament. But there is an aspect of this that can become a pastoral consideration. You need to at least have a sense that your pastor is aware of the struggles of his people so you can minister to them, or your elders generally. So that's probably a judgment call, church to church. I wouldn't just throw away my theological distinctions because I think the Baptists down the street are like more based or something. I think that's in some senses confusing. Um, Confusing. I never like to use the word spheres. It's confusing institutions and what should be
Hmm.
expected. But there's probably some kind of balance. Like if your elders are just completely oblivious, almost intentionally so, to problems that are real in your social and cultural life. That's it's not that they're not based or don't get it. It's that they're being um, inattentive to their sheep in a pastoral way. Well, that's a much more worthy kind of charge. They're not being very pastoral. They're not caring for their flock well. That's a general charge. You could make that about anything. So that's a kind of convoluted answer, but I would just say, hang on to your theological and traditional confessional distinctives. These are important. It's part of again, not lapsing back into some of the mainline issues we've been describing, where those things all die or get placed in a sort of secondary category. I think these distinctions are good. I think Baptist Presbyterians, whatever, should have as much unity as possible across denominational lines for, sort of outward facing purposes and have good uh, relations in that way. But I think people, if you're Presbyterian or conviction, you should try to find a good Presbyterian church. And if you're in a place where, and I've talked to people like this, there's just no gospel preaching except at the Baptist church. Well, that's where you go. That's a very like triage kind of decision to make, because you have to get the word. Don't sit at home and watch YouTube videos. Be in
Yeah.
a real church. But most places that is not really the choice. Most places, some places it is. And so you should try to be in a church that agrees with your theological tradition and it has good preaching of these things. And then, the based test like how much do your pastors know what time it is. I mean, to me that is secondary. And maybe it's up to you to, in a very submissive and helpful way to your elders, to try to help them with that. But it shouldn't be a reason you break communion, unless it's an extreme situation that we can, I guess, come up with hypotheticals, but where they're just completely ignorant of real life for some reason. I don't think that's the case usually. So
Yeah, that's helpful. Anything else that you want to add about Reconquista or anything that we've discussed tonight?
no, I think we beat up Zoomer pretty well. Again, I like Zoomer, and I like
As do I.
as I said, I like the vibes. I like that he's establishmentarian. I like that he loves American Protestant history and is longing for historical continuity and our beautiful buildings and our heritage back. Those are all instincts and passions that I share. So this is a difference in this is debating the viability of a particular strategy.
Yeah.
And I've registered my reservations and critiques. I think that's sufficient. None of it will probably be new to him. He's either gotten it from he's probably gotten it from elsewhere. But I think it is a constructive, I think, to talk about it, because it's a possible future. It's a possible strategy. I just don't think it's especially likely, pragmatic, or prudential. But that's a disagreement, so that I think is fine. Again, it's created a lot of hullabaloo online. I don't really know why. It seems to me to be, if you critique it, it's nothing more than a thought exercise, which shouldn't be that offensive.
Right.
Unless you're, I guess, unless you're like losing church members to it or something, maybe that would be frustrating. But I haven't heard of that. So anyway, we beat it up pretty well, and I think that's good. If he comes out with more concrete and sharpened strategies that have a better return on investment, maybe we can reevaluate. But for now, I would just say, let's get the beautiful buildings back. But first, make sure you got to stop the bleeding in certain places. We need to strengthen our institutions that we have. We need to prepare for, we're at the very beginning of negative world. We need to prepare for it to be worse, and we also need to prepare to take back territory. I mean, that's some of the whole strategy, that I've laid out, or the purpose. In the end, it's not a defensive crouch at the end of the day. So we need to prepare for that, and we need to prepare leaders that are ready to do that. And part of that, which is something Zoomer has or can help with, is recalling your heritage and what we've lost, so you have something to be a little bit angry about.
Yeah.
And that's a good motivator. So
Yeah, I completely agree. Ultimately, Zoomer is a brother, and we wish him well. And if he proves us wrong, I'll be the first to say that
great.
I'm happy he proved us wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
But hopefully this will be uplifting in some sort of way for you listeners. And of course, Zoomer is welcome on anytime. If he ever wants to discuss these further, we can have Timon back on as well and make a whole night out of it. But either way, Timon, where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you're doing?
Yeah, just subscribe to AmericanReformer.org. It's where I write elsewhere, but it's where most of my writing, and you'll get it appears, and you'll get a feel for the bigger project there. Everything, we've got great writers that contribute to the journal. Publish daily, multiple times a day, so there's always something to read. So just check that out. I've of course on Twitter too, but I think if everyone would go to American Reformer and read there. I mean, we've published Zoomer before, and critiques from Philip Derrida, and a back and forth there. So we try to engage these kind of conversations, and it is nice to see signs of life in them, even if ultimately the first volleys don't seem that viable.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. Awesome. Well, everyone check out AmericanReformer.org and be sure to support everything that they're doing there. We thank you all for listening. We really appreciate all your support. Feel free to go over to our Substack, forgeandanvil.substack.com. We appreciate it so much. We'll see you next time.